The Carpenter and the Cradle, a History Weaver Adventure, Book 1, by Connie Worden, read by the author. Chapter 20. "And now the question," Limo said. "What do we decide to do with the stranger? Men, you've heard all that Ko and Taku know about him and what they suspect. Now his fate is in our hands. From what you've heard, let's hear suggestions as how to deal with him." Porter, just a few years older than Ko, a short, slight, shy man, stood uncertainly. "If I may be permitted," he said. "Yes, Porter," Limo said. Though Ko couldn't see his father's face, he could almost hear the frown in his voice. "Maybe we should ask the man to tell his own story. It's hard to judge his fate when we don't positively know the truth. Our law tells us to allow a man to speak for himself before sentence is passed on him." Several men around the fire waved the idea away dismissively, and Limo said, "Yes, of course, our law that applies to our people, but as you know, the enemy would only tell lies. There are no laws saying a suspected enemy must be heard before sentence is passed. It's for us to decide if the man is an enemy." Porter had gone to sit down, but he quickly rose to his feet again and said hesitantly, "But he is only a suspected enemy. It's hard to know how to judge from what we've heard." One of the men frowned fiercely at Porter, and Ko knew Porter, who had made a motion to sit, should have been acknowledged again before speaking again. Porter had forgotten himself. Ko burned with shame for him, but Limo said nothing about his breach of protocol. Besides, Porter hadn't quite taken his seat on the ground again. It was debatable what protocol would dictate in his case. Limo simply said, "Even for a suspected enemy, there are no laws requiring us to hear his tale from his own lips. That is simply for our people alone." Porter resumed his seat on the ground, staring into the firelight. "Let's hear suggestions," Limo barked in his most authoritative voice. Ko couldn't help comparing how restrained and systematic their methods of counsel were compared to what he had witnessed around the fireside of another council. That one, as he lay tied under the tree listening, had been a mass of chaos and shouting and everyone talking at once. There were so many reasons his people were superior to the enemy and their ways of doing things. But no one wanted to speak now, not after Porter's failure. There was unbroken silence for a long moment. Coral raised her head and laughed. Will was perched on the ladder to the hayloft that was rapidly becoming the second story, pretending to be a parrot. They did occasionally manage to have fun while working on the barn restoration. "Pretty girl! Pretty girl!" Will squawked at his sister. He stopped the imitation abruptly. "Speaking of pretty girls, that new friend of yours is one, wouldn't you say?" Coral tossed her head at him. "What does it matter what I say? It's obvious you think so from what you just said. I think all my new friends are pretty girls. Which one in particular is the one that's caught your eye? June is the brunette and July is the redhead, in case you can't remember which one is which." "I can't remember her name. She looks Asian. You know which one I mean?" "Fern?" Coral tried hard to control her surprise. Sure, Fern was a pretty girl, she supposed. If she really thought about it, yes, Fern was a pretty girl. But she was always in the background, never putting herself forward. She wasn't the type of girl who tried to make herself look like a pretty girl. It surprised her that Will would have noticed her. She would have thought, based on past experience, that the type Will noticed was a dyed blonde with lots of makeup and a very obviously glamorous face. "She's not your usual type, is she?" Coral asked him. Will shrugged. "Change is good." "Do you want me to mention you to her?" Coral asked curiously. "No," Will said quickly and a little too loud. No need to do that. I'm just making an observation." Is that what you're doing? Pretty sure when you make that kind of observation, it adds up to being a little more than just an observation. You like her." Will shrugged again. "Doesn't mean you have to tell her that, do you? I mean, I don't know her at all. She seems nice, though, is she?" "Very nice," Coral agreed heartily. "Very unsure of herself, I think, but that makes me like her more. I'm not big on your usual type, who generally seem to think a lot of themselves." "Maybe that's what I liked about her," Will said, his voice quieter than his usual boisterous volume. He looked off into the distance through the window of the hayloft. "Oh dear, in other words, you think she's special. She's not like the other girls. I think you're quite smitten," Coral decided. "And on first meeting, too." "Never mind, it's no big deal," Will said huffily. "Can't a guy make conversation with his sister about her friends?" He rose from his perch and disappeared into the loft and out of sight. Coral couldn't let it rest that easily, however. "Sure he can," she called after him. "If a guy doesn't mind having his sister knowing his secret and bugging him about it endlessly, feel free to talk to me about my friends any time in that case." There was no answer from Will. Coral smiled to herself. He hadn't sworn her to secrecy, and she hadn't promised anything. A little attention from her brother just might be the confidence booster Fern needed. Coral wasn't one to play matchmaker or anything, but there might not be any harm in reporting to Fern what Will had said. It might do her shy friend some good, in fact. Will reappeared and began climbing down the ladder. "Hey, you want to get out of here for a little, take a break, and go do some treasure hunting?" Will's latest passion had been metal detecting. Since they'd been living on the Cherry Barn property, he'd taken to exploring the grounds surrounding the old barn and even back into the woods on their property. Coral wasn't quite the enthusiast Will was. Their searches had produced only rubbish buried in the ground, presumably from their Grandpa Cherry or his predecessors. Rusty nails and tin cans and old batteries and what appeared to be car parts and the bed springs of an old mattress that had apparently been buried whole, but of which everything but the metal had rotted away through the years. Coral had been unimpressed, but Will was sure they would discover something worth discovering eventually, and even the bits of debris they'd turned up he found interesting, for adding to their knowledge of the history of the property. He'd decided there must have been an outbuilding on the site they'd picked out for a garden plot where they'd discovered all the nails. "Changing the subject?" Coral asked slyly. "No, just ready to get out of the house for a bit," Will answered with his back to her, already on his way out the door. Coral decided she could use some fresh air as well. She dropped the sanding block with which she'd been rasping smooth the rough lumber of the windowsills, and followed Will out into the bright summer's day.